Outlines are in the back if you need one. First Corinthians chapter 9. And for the record, I knew about the doctor's appointment. I just thought it was Friday. I meant to mention this on Sunday, and I will, God willing, this coming Sunday, but there are a number of new things in the back for you guys to check out. Coffee mugs, T-shirts, auto decals, stuff that if you want you can sign up to get. There's a suggested donation, but really it's however you're able. And also there's a sign-up sheet for a ladies' retreat that's coming up in a couple months. Please sign up for that if you want to attend. That should be really good at Camp Grandview. Courtney's leading the charge on that. So sign up for the ladies' retreat. Let's do this. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 tonight. Let's ask the Lord's blessing and we'll get started. God, thank you for this night that you've given us, this opportunity to open your word, and help us to draw from it good principles, practical application for Christian living, and help us to see the great truths of the gospel laid out in the life of the church. Thank you for the Corinthians, Lord, deeply imperfect people like us, with many problems like us. And the solutions that you give to their problems are directly relevant to our lives here and now. Bless our discussion. Be with those who can't be here because they're ill or suffering otherwise. Be with us as we open your word tonight and use this to help us to be better for you. When we leave this place, may it be in deeper fellowship with you and with each other. In your name, amen. Okay, so this is a really interesting chapter. It almost seems like it's a total shocking change of subject from chapter 8. It's not, but we'll talk about why here in a minute. Do you remember anything about chapter 8? Chapter 8's just 13 verses. We did it in one Wednesday just a week ago. Chapter 8 was discussing the question of, can you eat meat offered to an idol? Is a Christian allowed to go eat meat offered to an idol? And what was the answer? Do you guys remember? Yeah, so we have, as long as it doesn't offend someone else, we have a hand? No, you're on the right track.
Should we do it, or?
Rather than can we, should we?
Yeah.
Wow, that really makes my heart glow. Thank you. The big insight from last week was that the question, can you eat meat offered to an idol, is really the wrong question. Rather than asking, do I have permission to do this, you should be asking, is this best? Not so much can I do it, but should I do it? And the answer was, at least in their context, probably not, because it could cause your brother to offend or to stumble. And so you have this liberty, you have this freedom to go do this thing. And Paul's saying, here's an opportunity where it might be best for you to take your freedom and put it aside for a greater purpose. You might take your liberty and what you even deserve and put that aside for something better. And then chapter 9 rolls around. And chapter 9 feels like a complete change of subject, but it's not. Because chapter 9 is Paul taking that same principle of, I'm going to take something that I deserve and have a right to, and I'm going to put it aside for something better. Paul takes that principle and applies it to his life as a gospel minister. A lot of Corinthians, the letters, it sounds like you're eavesdropping. You ever been like in a restaurant or a store and a family is having a really tense, dramatic conversation? And you know you shouldn't be listening, but you really want to listen, the kind of conversation? 1 Corinthians reads like that. They are having a really tense, dramatic conversation, and we have the privilege of eavesdropping a little bit. It seems that some people at Corinth had been saying that Paul was not a real apostle, or Paul was not a good apostle. And one of the reasons we know this guy Paul isn't a good apostle is he won't even take money. He insists on working a day job. He's not a real apostle, he insists on working a day job. And this is where Paul starts that discussion. He asks a series of rhetorical questions, and each of them, at least at the start, the answer is yes. Would somebody read for us 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 and 2?
Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you. For the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord.
Okay, so Paul is going heads on here. These are rhetorical questions. The answer is meant to be yes. Yes, I am an apostle, Paul says. And yes, I am free. I can make my own decisions. And yes, Paul says, I have seen Jesus Christ, our Lord. This is one of the passages that helps us to understand that a criteria for being an apostle is seeing Jesus. If you haven't seen Jesus in the flesh, you cannot be said to be an apostle in this sense. In fact, the Corinthians ought to know that he's an apostle, because what are the Corinthians to Paul? The Corinthians are his work. It must really be galling for Paul to hear from the church at Corinth that people are saying you're not really an apostle, because he spent a year and a half living in Corinth and basically founded this church. He's poured more into Corinth than he has anywhere. And these are the people who are saying, yeah, we don't really think you're an apostle, because it seems like you like to work your day job and maybe your heart's not really in it, Paul. How would that make you feel? If you pour your life into a place and they say, yeah, maybe your heart's not really in it. You know, we don't know why you insist on working a day job. The natural thing would be to be upset, right? And Paul is upset, but he does this cool thing where you can kind of feel his simmering anger, but he takes it and he turns it to a teaching moment. And he teaches something good out of this ugly situation. He says in verse 2, he's pointing out his relationship to the Corinthians. Yeah, I am an apostle, and I am in you especially. The church at Corinth is the seal of his apostleship. Do you remember how things started in Corinth? He came to Corinth. In the book of Acts, it tells the story. He came to Corinth kind of on the run. There had been converts in other places, but things were not going well. And everywhere he went, he got kicked out, sometimes very violently. And he comes to Corinth. He finds in Corinth friends and believers. And Jesus appears to him in a vision. And do you remember what Jesus said to Paul in the vision? Jesus said, do not be afraid. I have many people in this city. And that was the beginning of Paul's year and a half of ministry in Corinth. And so even in Corinth, Jesus appeared to Paul and, as it were, sent him into that city. And that's the beginning of his work in Corinth. So his apostleship is really wrapped up at the church in Corinth. He strongly asserts that he is an apostle. And this helps us just practically in the Christian life. Sometimes people will make false accusations about you. They will say bad things about you. And while we ought to be meek in the Christian life, this is one of many examples of Christians standing up for themselves. It is appropriate to stand up for the truth about yourself. You don't have to just take it quietly. Now, there's a line there, and there's wisdom about being drug into arguments that are going to become pointless and making things about yourself. But Paul stands up for the truth of his office. He is an apostle. And so he says to them, this is my answer. My answer to you that examine me is this, in verse 3. And now more rhetorical questions. Incidentally, something you learn studying the New Testament, when Paul gets mad, he speaks in questions. Just something about Paul, when he's like really on fire, he starts firing off these rhetorical questions. It's his lawyer training. Would somebody like to read some of these questions for us? Verses 1 Corinthians 4, 1 through, we'll do 1 through 6. 1 Corinthians 4, oh no, I'm sorry, sorry. Let's calm down here. I'm getting fired up. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 4 through 6. Okay, so a lot of good stuff here. First question, what's his first question? It's kind of a hard one to figure out. And this is a good Bible study moment, using the tools in your tool belt. If you don't understand something, look at what the verses around it are referring to. It's pretty obvious that the verses, like in verse 6, we're talking about working for a living and not working for a living. So he says in verse 4, do we not have power or authority to eat and drink? What do you think he's talking about? Do you think it's possible he's talking about don't we have the authority to eat and drink meat offered to idols? Because that's what happened in chapter 8, maybe. But what's the new context? Let's just keep reading and let that simmer in the back of your head. If you read something, you don't understand it, sometimes it's helpful to continue through the chapter and see if you can figure it out from context. Don't we have power or the right to or the authority to have a believing wife? Literally, it's a sister, a wife. The idea is a Christian wife. Apparently, several of the apostles had wives. And also, Cephas, Peter, had a wife too. And some of the brethren of the Lord. They weren't apostles, but they were close kin to Jesus. And this is important because except for situations of single women like Lydia, it was pretty common for wives not to work outside of the home. And so if you have a wife and family, that means you are the breadwinner. So if the apostles have a wife and family, then they're making some kind of income. Somebody is feeding their family. And he's asking in verse 6, the question is, is it only me and Barnabas? Apparently Barnabas did this too, that don't have the power to forbear working, that can't not work. So what we're talking about here is not meat offered to idols anymore. We're talking about being supported in the gospel ministry. And this is the context where he says, don't we have authority to eat or drink? The context is at the expense of the churches. So verse 4 is asking the question, shouldn't the churches be feeding us? Shouldn't the churches be supporting us? Verse 5 is asking the question, shouldn't the churches be supporting our wives if we got married and our families? Verse 6 is asking the question, how come only I and Barnabas, how come we're the only ones that aren't allowed to leave off working? So this is the question that Paul is asking. He's saying he does have authority to be supported. Now, peeking ahead a little bit, or maybe if you know the story, does Paul take money from the churches? Is he supported? No, he's not. So he's doing something interesting here. He's saying, I have a right to do this. I have a right to be supported by the churches, but I'm not going to be supported by the churches. I'm going to think about why. We'll discuss why, but think about why. Paul lays out this argument. It's completely normal for people to be supported in their profession. If you go to war, who pays your salary? You know, if you go to war, if you're a soldier, who's paying your salary? The government, the taxpayers. If you have a farm or a vineyard and you plant crops, where's your food going to come from? That farm or vineyard. If you're a shepherd and you have sheep, where is your mutton and your milk and your wool going to come from? From the flock. It's normal every day in every situation for people to be supported in their profession. And Paul is saying that gospel ministry is a profession too. And it would be completely normal for people to be supported in gospel ministry. Can you guys think of any biblical examples of people being supported in ministry and the expectation that they would be? Yeah, so Betty says the priest. What were you going to say, Scott? Yeah, so yes, the Old Testament priests, and Paul mentions this in verse, well, we'll get there in due time, but Paul mentions this, that Old Testament priests were supported in the priestly ministry. And when they were retirement age, they were supported in their retirement as well. In fact, there's this whole biblical principle, and I'm calling it the ox principle, in verse 9. For it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Does God take care for oxen? So what's the picture here? It's helpful to understand what's being described. You work doing farm work. You grow. I had this discussion with somebody recently. In your King James Bible, when it says corn, every time it says corn, it's not describing corn on the cob. When you read corn, if you imagine corn on the cob, you are wrong. It does not describe corn on the cob. That didn't exist in this part of the world. 400 years ago, the word corn described any kind of grain. So we're talking about wheat, rye, barley. Any kind of grain was corn. And so an ox treading out corn is like wheat. You take wheat, like we saw a little while ago in the Gospel of Matthew, it's got this hull, this husky shell on it, and you need to rub it off or beat it off or shake it off or somehow. And one way to do that really efficiently is to get a big animal to walk over it. And so you put your wheat with the holes still on it in a trough, a big circular trough, and you have animals walk on it. And it beats the outer coating off, and you winnow the outer coating away. And so these are ox, and they're treading the corn. They're processing the grain for milling later on. And so if you don't muzzle the ox while it's treading out the corn, while it's processing the grain, what's it going to do? It's going to want to eat some. And Paul asks, he's inviting the Corinthians at the end here, doesn't God take care for oxen? He's inviting the Corinthians to think, is this principle really about oxen? Contextually, is this principle really about oxen? Well, let's look at what it is. Let's look at where it appears. So Paul's quoting Deuteronomy chapter 25, if you want to turn there. So Deuteronomy 25, I'm going to read the specific verse is verse 4, but I'm going to read the verses leading up to it and following it to get us some context. So Deuteronomy 25:1. If there be a controversy between men, and they come into judgment, and the judge may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. In other words, the judge needs to judge rightly. And it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and to be beaten before his face, according to his fault by a certain number. So he's going to receive proportional punishment based on his crime. Up to 40 stripes in verse 3. 40 stripes he may be given and not exceeding. Lest, if he should exceed and beat him above with many stripes, then his brothers should seem vile unto thee. So proportional punishment for your crime, but there's always an upper limit so that nobody's left bitter and it's just resolved in a reasonable manner, which is, in Paul's day, the Jews had a custom of always delivering a beating of 39 stripes, because you wouldn't want to accidentally beat somebody one too many times, and so we stop at 39. And that's why Paul says that 3 times he was beaten 39 stripes. And then verse 4 kicks in. Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn. So what just happened? Why were we talking about like relationships and we're suddenly talking about animals? This is a thinking caps moment here. This is a time to think critically about the Bible. Verse 5 continues on, and it's talking about relationships. If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go unto her, and take her to wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And so we're talking about, for the whole rest of the chapter, we're talking about relationships and things that you should do in society. But verse 4 is talking about oxes and corn. Any ideas why? Is it in there in the wrong place? Like, did somebody mess that up and put that in the wrong place? Yeah, Eric points out, Paul's using an analogy like Jesus did, and that analogy is grounded in the Old Testament because it's pretty clear from the context, that whole Old Testament passage is about how people should treat each other. And so this principle that a laborer is worthy of his wage, that if somebody's doing the work, they ought to benefit from that work, that's an Old Testament principle. And it's being applied here to gospel ministry. The statement about plowing, well, we'll get there. So back in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 10, he says it altogether for our sakes. No doubt, for our sakes this is written. He that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope. So that second statement in verse 10, the one that plows should plow in hope, the one that threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope, that's a pretty clear reference to the idea that people should benefit from their labor. This is not like mind-blowing stuff here. Paul is saying the basic reason the apostles, and not just apostles, but even Barnabas and these full-time Christian ministers have a right to benefit from the ministry is because it's their profession. It's what they do. And people have a right to be supported in their profession. I'm curious, you guys, if you have study Bibles, does anybody have the cross-reference there? So he says, it is written. And 9 times out of 10, it is written in the New Testament tells us this is a quote from the Old Testament. So what's the cross-reference there? Does anybody have it? What's the Old Testament passage? I won't leave it silent for too long because you're not going to find one. A little bit of a trick question. There is none. This is a mystery. We don't know what Paul's referring to. Is he paraphrasing an Old Testament passage? Or is this just a common proverb in his day? The basic principle, what's being taught, is taught elsewhere in the Bible. But this is an example, we just have to be honest about it, this is an example where Paul's talking about something and we're not sure what he's talking about. Remember, we're not the first audience of these letters. These letters weren't just written to us. So this is a principle. As an apostle, and really as a gospel minister, Paul has a right to be supported by the churches. Verse 14 sums it all up. Even so has the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel, or by the gospel. So, and this isn't the main point of the passage, but Paul's laying this out. He's saying to the Corinthians, it would be completely right for me to demand support from you. That would be completely appropriate. Gospel ministers have a right to be supported in the gospel by the churches. And we'll talk about application at the end, but that's Paul's right as an apostle. Remember, this whole chapter, though, is about Paul saying, I have these rights. These are my rights. But I'm going to take my rights and put them aside for something else, for something better. And now we get to the something better. Would somebody read for us verse 15? 1 Corinthians 9:15.
None of these things, nor have I written these things, that I should be done so to me. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make me boasting void.
Okay, good. So Paul's saying, I haven't done any of these things, and I'm not writing this. I know Paul, it's kind of funny here. Paul's saying, I know I just wrote like 3 paragraphs about how you should be paying your ministers, but I don't want you to pay me, Paul says. Because Paul says it's actually to my advantage. My boast, my glory, the thing I'm really proud of, Paul says, is that I'm not taking money from you. That's Paul's glory. That's what he's boasting in. Paul has waived the right to be supported so that he can better serve the Corinthians. He does it for an interesting reason. I'll read verses 16 and 17. For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. For necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe unto me if I preach not the gospel. Paul's saying, I know I'm preaching the gospel, but I kind of have to preach the gospel. In fact, if I didn't preach the gospel, I think something really bad would happen to me. Why does Paul have this attitude about preaching the gospel? What's Paul's life story? How did he become a gospel preacher?
Merciful to him.
Yeah, Paul remembers how God was merciful to him, how he was spiritually blind, and Jesus made him physically blind, and then Jesus took away his physical blindness and his spiritual blindness, and he saw the truth completely, and he was made a gospel minister. Paul feels like God has a call on his life, like a call of ownership on his life. And this is interesting because isn't this true of all of us as Christians? Like God has a call of ownership on all of our lives as Christians. So he's saying, I feel like if I didn't preach the gospel, I would be out of God's will. And by the way, that is a really good way to think about like a calling to ministry. People have lots of ideas about a calling to ministry. The best way I know of to think about a calling to ministry is this. Could you be in God's will unless you were doing it? Because you can do other things, you might want to do other things, but the question is it God's will that you do this and this alone? That's the picture of a call to ministry. And so let me ask a question at this point. If Paul has this call of God upon his life, and all the apostles really do, right? Because they were all saved from sin. Why is it appropriate for the apostles to receive support? Why do you guys think? Why is it appropriate? Paul just spent 14 verses explaining how churches ought to be supporting the people that serve them. And yeah, that's Jesus. Yeah, Jesus often calls people that serve him to depend on that service, right? And something I think about a lot is the little mention in verse 5 of the wives, and presumably children as well. If you're single, if God has given you the gift of singleness, it's probably more appropriate for you to say, I'm going to serve a church and I'm just not going to take anything for it. But if God has given you the gift of a family, now you have a whole different thing to worry about. And so it could actually be very selfish of you to say, oh, I'm just going to serve the church for its own sake. Well, what about your family? How does that impact your family? And so Paul has the gift of singleness. He doesn't need it in the same way that Peter does, in the same way that James does, the other apostles who have families. Paul thinks that he really has no option other than preaching the gospel. And so his only option to do some kind of something special, to receive extra rewards, if we can think about that, is to preach it voluntarily, to do it without being paid. And that's what he's saying in verse 18. What is my reward then? This, verily that, when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. So this is so cool. Verse 18 so powerfully contrasts with verse 1. Not verse 1, verse 4. In verse 4, he's saying, I have authority to be supported by the churches. And then in verse 18, he's saying, but I will preach the gospel for free so that I don't abuse my authority in the churches. So Paul has a right, and he's putting that right aside to be a better servant. And this is the principle of selflessness. The ox principle is a principle that people have a right to be supported in their profession. And gospel ministry is a profession. But the principle of selflessness, which is really the heart of this section, is that for Paul at least, he is willing to give up his rights in order to better serve the Corinthian church. This is a very powerful picture of good gospel ministry. It's not for everybody, especially people with families. But if God has given you the ability to live extremely simply or to be supported by other means, this might be for you. Paul's not seeking to be true to himself. He's not asserting his rights. He's not even seeking his preferences. Rather, Paul puts self, rights, and preferences on the altar for the purpose of gospel ministry. He really points that out in verses 19 through 22. Would somebody read for us 19 and 20? 1 Corinthians 9, 19 and 20. Mm-hmm. 1 Corinthians 9, 19 and 20.
Though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law.
Okay. And this goes on, but I want to stop here to show us what Paul is doing. He has freedom. He can choose what he wants to do. But he's taken his freedom and he's given that over, and he's made himself a servant to all people. For what purpose? What does he mean by gaining them? Maybe somebody has a different translation there, like at the end of verse 19, that I might gain. What does he mean by gaining them? Yeah. Yes, winning believers. This is part of where we get the phrase, and I don't really like it for evangelism, but we get the phrase soul winning. The idea is I'm going to do everything I can to have a positive influence over these people for Christ. And so Paul is going to take his liberties, he's going to put them aside to have a positive influence. For Jewish people, Paul wants to have a relationship with them. He wants to connect with them. He's going to become as Jewish as he can for them. For people that are under the law, they have scruples about what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. And maybe you look at them and you think, oh, that's silly, you're kind of a legalist. But for them, it's really serious. Paul's going to be like them. For people that that don't have the law in verse 21, in other words, Gentiles, Paul's going to be like them. Now, with the caveat, not being without law to God, but under the law of Christ. Paul's saying, I'm not just going to go do anything, but I'm going to do everything I can to try to reach people where they are. And this is a powerful picture of how evangelism ought to work. So, a very famous statistic that makes the rounds of the internet constantly and is probably true, but I can't tell you the source of it, talks about how people start coming to a church. And the number of people that come to a church from like door knocking, cold calling, things like that. Anyone want to guess at the percentage according to this one statistic? Not zero, but pretty small percent. It's about 5%. The number of people that come due to advertising, especially like targeted advertising, it's like 5 or 10%. The number of people, the vast majority of people, over 80% of people that visit a church, visit because their friend invited them. Like that is if you want to bring people to church, make friends and invite them to church. That is the way to get people to church. That is by far the most effective way. Make friends and invite them to church. And that is essentially what Paul is doing here. Paul is saying, I'm going to build a relationship with people. I have Jewish backgrounds. I'm going to build a relationship with my Jewish friends. I'm going to build a relationship with Gentiles. I'm going to build relationships as much as I can to bring them to Christ. That's what Paul is doing here. Now, do you think Paul, even though he was raised a Pharisee, do you think Paul loved hanging out with the Pharisees? Do you think he got kind of tired of that sometimes, maybe kind of irritated or annoyed? He was raised Jewish. He probably had pretty strong opinions about food and cleanliness. Do you think he always enjoyed hanging out with Gentiles? The smell and eating pig and stuff? Probably not. Probably didn't enjoy that. But the picture here is in every situation, Paul is saying, I'm going to put my rights and preferences aside for the purpose of bringing people to Christ. That's the service principle. He goes on to say, verse 22 really speaks to the people that won't eat meat offered to idols. To the weak I became as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And so the rest is kind of summary, but this is the very powerful contrast of the chapter. In the first 14 verses, Paul argues forcefully that a person in gospel ministry deserves to be supported by the churches. That is good and appropriate. And then for the next 5 verses-ish, Paul says, but in my case, because I don't have a family and I'm kind of in a special situation, I am going to take those rights and put them aside for the good of the gospel, and especially you guys, the Corinthians. And now we see Paul sums it all up and kind of gives us his general approach to life in the last 4 verses, verses 24 through 27. Don't you know, Paul says, know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that you may obtain. So we're suddenly talking about sports. The Corinthians, people in this world, they were about as obsessed with sports as our culture. They watched sports all the time. They played sports. They went to the gym. They were pretty athletic people. They were really into sports. If you won at the Olympics, for example, the ancient Olympics, not today, you were set for life. Like even though there wasn't technically a prize, a monetary prize, when you came home, you were the town hero, and you were set for life. So Paul says, hey, when you have a race, how many people get first place in the race? How many people? Just one, right? Not everybody wins the race. What kind of person wins the race? What do you got to do if you want to win a race? Train. What were you going to say? Oh. Train, practice. You got to work. You got to work at it. And this is Paul saying, hey, my life isn't easy. The life that I've chosen, this gospel ministry life, it's not easy. but I'm going to work at it. I'm going to strive for it. In fact, I'm like an Olympic athlete, Paul says. In verse 25, every man that strives for the mastery is temperate. So striving for the mastery, just kind of a technical term, it describes trying to win a competition. And by the way, that word striving, it's the word agony. It's this big, hard, great-hearted, sometimes painful effort. You're going to try and win the competition. You're going to try and win the tournament. Everyone that tries to win the competition has to be temperate in all things. You've got to be smart about how you're spending your time. You've got to be measured. You've got to be careful. You've got to be trainee-oriented. That's how you win. And they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, a temporary prize, but we're doing it for something incorruptible. And Paul says, that's how I run, not uncertainly. That's how I fight, not as one who beats the air. Does anyone have a different translation on the end of verse 26? Not as one who beats the air? I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. It's the same basic picture. The idea is someone who's always missing, someone who's ineffectual. One thing, if you've ever boxed, one thing you learn is that it takes a huge amount of energy to actually keep your hands up, to keep moving, and to throw punches. Like it takes a ton of energy. And every time you throw a punch that doesn't stick, ill-timed or misplaced, you're burning energy. Your arms get tired, your hands get heavy. Paul is saying, what I'm trying to do in my life is to use my time and resources and energy in the best possible way, as smart as possible. I'm trying to discipline myself. I keep my body under subjection, he says in verse 27. Lest by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. He's using an athletic term here. It's really more like disqualified. He's not talking about losing his salvation, but losing rewards, the effect of his life and ministry. And so this is Paul's general approach to life. He makes himself a servant to all. He puts his bodily desires, an easier life, disposable income, marriage, all those sorts of things, he puts them aside so that he can pass the test and receive the greatest reward. So what do we say to this? We got about 7 minutes to discuss application. This is a very personal note from Paul here. Let's talk about what I'm calling the ox principle first, the first 14 verses. It is good, healthy, and appropriate for people to be supported in their profession. Like that is the right answer for people. So how does that apply? This is probably the most generic one, but how does that apply in the way that we treat others? What do you guys think? Sarah?
Encourage your employees, but also to be a worker that is not just like a clock it and go person.
Yeah.
Actually find some fulfillment in what you're doing.
Yeah, I like that. I didn't think about that from the employee perspective too. But yeah, to be a fair employer, to give your employees what they're worth, but also as an employee to be worth something, right? Like to be a good ox, right? To actually do your job. This is directly relevant to the lives of churches, and we don't need to belabor that, but churches ought to be supporting gospel ministers. The basic principle, though, is that people ought to be supported in their profession, what they're doing. Let's talk more about Paul's principle of selflessness in gospel ministry, the servant principle. What are ways that we can put our preferences aside in order to better share the gospel with people? What does that look like? Sarah?
Like a lot that stands out to it is just kind of like, there's a lot of apologetics involved with it. Like when you look at, becoming a Jew or becoming a Pharisee, like you have to learn what people believe in order to understand them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part too of being able to invite someone to church is to be able to get to a point in a conversation where they can understand you.
Yeah. You have to, so Sarah points out, you have to learn what people believe in order to understand them, so that, and I'm simplifying, so that they can understand you. And you used the interesting word apologetics, which isn't wrong, but when I think apologetics, I'm immediately like, okay, like let's go. You're kind of on edge, like, okay, we're going to have a fight about this. A different word to use might be relationship. Like, in order to build a relationship with somebody, you have to be genuinely interested in who they are and what they believe. We have a neighbor, probably it's not watching, but I'm not going to use his name. We have a neighbor where I've worked to share the gospel with, and we haven't really got past the stage of, like, what do you believe and why? But I'm not going to try to preach the gospel to him until at least I know where he's coming from, who he is. And this is Paul's principle. I have to put self aside. So you see somebody at the store, and based on the way maybe their appearance or the way they're carrying themselves, maybe the way they talk, you just immediately think, oh boy, I want to steer clear of this person. I don't like this person. Something about this person makes me really uncomfortable. I'm not saying it's God's will for you to immediately go give that person a hug and try and be their best friend. But if you want to share the gospel with people, you got to get over that this person makes me uncomfortable thing and be willing to actually try to get to know them, to meet them where they are. That's what Paul is doing here. He's putting self aside in order to better share the gospel. What are some other applications of that principle? Betty?
Trying to give them an example of, you're not in this ministry for money.
Yeah.
And that he was a tent maker. He did work outside of his ministry whenever he could. And it's not about this, like you're going to have the big mega church making all this money. It's not about money, I think.
Yes.
Or gain.
Yes. Paul is taking the focus off gain, right? And that's something that we know the Corinthians were really into money. They were pretty wealthy people. And Paul is saying none of that really matters. How else? How do we meet people? How do we show genuine interest in people and meet them where they are?
To you.
Yeah, reflecting on the grace that was shown to you. And maybe if you're older, if you came to faith later in life, how did you come to faith? You know, I imagine for every one of us, there's a person in our lives that discipled us and helped us. And maybe that person has a really different personality than us. Maybe you wouldn't naturally click with that person. But nevertheless, God is able to use them. So let's think about this picture of striving for mastery. Paul has laid out the whole life using an athletic metaphor, and that's really where I got the title for this, The Man in the Arena, which I restrained myself from publishing or putting it on the outline because it irritates me when people put things in sermon outlines that aren't directly applicable to the sermon. But Teddy Roosevelt has a fantastic speech. It's about 2 minutes called The Man in the Arena, and it's really good, but I'll stop there. How do we strive for the mastery? What does it look like for us to strive for the mastery? How do you win? How do you win at the Olympics? Training, yeah. For us, the training ground is very much the church. Also our personal devotional, prayer life, things like that. Is that what you said, Miss Susan? Okay, training. What about cheating? You know, there were some people, I think it was the Boston Marathon, scored outstanding times in the Boston Marathon, crossed the finish line way ahead of everybody else, and people immediately thought that it was kind of fishy because they weren't sweaty at all. And it was early in the days of GPS technology, and it was one of the first times the marathon runners had gotten GPS bracelets. And so they went and looked at the records, and sure enough, these people had like hopped on the subway. And so they won the marathon, right? They crossed the finish line first. Did they win? No, not really. Are there ways that we might be tempted to cheat in the Christian life? To take shortcuts in the Christian life? Absolutely. Absolutely. We have to subject ourselves too. I was convicted about this with a very specific habit that I have in verse 27 tonight. Sometimes, in fact, regularly in the Christian life, there are things you want that are not necessarily bad, but the right answer in the Christian life for our training is to say no to those things, to put yourself under subjection for a greater goal. How else? How do we strive for the mastery? How do we win? Yeah. 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 Scott points out how this relates to Jesus' teaching to take up our cross, and Paul teaches that he dies daily. We've got to be willing to say no to ourselves. That's really what this whole chapter is about. I have a right, Paul says, I have a right to be paid, and it would make my life easier. But I'm going to say no to that because I have the opportunity to say no to it. Paul says, I have a right to my preferences and my ethnicity and who I am, but I'm going to say no to that thing as well because it'll help me reach others. Paul's saying no to all kinds of things in life so that he can say yes to the best thing. And that's an important thing to take away. Everything that we really want, we have to say no to other things too. So, big picture, things to take away. It is completely appropriate and it is good for people to be supported in their profession. We have these rights, but sometimes in special circumstances, it's also good for us to deny our rights. In any event, our attitude really should be that of Paul's, that we strive for the mastery, that our life is led like an athletic competition. But let's ask the Lord's blessing and we'll go home. God, thank you for this night. Lord, bless us and keep us and help us to be faithful to you. Lord, help us to encourage one another and help us to be willing to put self aside for a greater good. God, thank you that that good is greater and that in the end we will see that it is worth it. Help us to follow Paul even as he followed you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I don't think this references anybody in this room, but if you have teenagers at Elevate, you're supposed to go get them. Don't just forget about them.